Chapter 3 of the Recollections of the Civil War by Charles Dana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Savannah Allday. Recollections of the Civil War by Charles Dana. Chapter 3. Before and around Vicksburg. The hard job of reopening the Mississippi. Admiral Porter runs the Confederate batteries. Headquarters moved to Smith's plantation. Delay and confusion in McClernand's command. The unsuccessful attack on Grand Gulf. The move to the East Shore. Mr. Dana secures a good horse. On the new lines adopted by General Grant, the work went on cheeringly, though every day changes were made in the details. I spent my days in riding from point to point, noting the progress. I went out often with Colonel G. Pride, the engineer officer in whose mess I was, and who was superintending the construction of the canal, which led from Duckport to the bayou. The work on this canal was a curious sight to see, for there was a force equal to 5 regiments at the digging, while a large number of pioneers were engaged in clearing the bayou beyond. The canal was opened on April 13th, and the authorities agreed that there was no reason to doubt its usefulness, though the obstructions in the bayou were so numerous that it was thought that it would require several days more to clear a passage for tugs and barges. One of my most interesting trips from Milliken's Bend was made with Major James H. Wilson to view the casemated batteries our engineers were constructing on the shore opposite Vicksburg. They hoped with the 30-pound Parrots they were putting in to be able to destroy any building in the town. From behind the levee of the peninsula, we were able with our glasses to examine the fortifications of Vicksburg. The best look I had at that town, however, while I was at Milliken's Bend, was not from the peninsula opposite, but from a gunboat. On April 12th I went down with the flag of truce to the vicinity of Vicksburg, so that I got a capital view. It was an ugly place with its line of bluffs commanding the channel for fully 7 miles, and battery piled above battery all the way. Admiral Porter's arrangements for carrying out the second part of Grant's scheme, that is, running the Vicksburg batteries, were all completed by April 16th, the ironclads and steamers being protected in vulnerable parts by bulwarks of hay, cotton, and sandbags, and the barges loaded with forage, coal, and the camp equipment of General McClernand's corps, which was already at New Carthage, were all completed by April 16th, the ironclads and steamers being protected in vulnerable parts by bulwarks of hay, cotton, and sandbags, and the barges loaded with forage, coal, and the camp equipment of General McClernand's corps, which was already at New Carthage. No doubt was felt that the design was known in Vicksburg, and it was arranged that Admiral Porter should open fire there with all his guns as he swept past the town, and that the new batteries on the levee opposite the city should also participate. Admiral Porter was to go with the expedition on a small tug, and he invited me to accompany him. But it seemed to me that I ought not to get out of my communications, and so refused. Instead, I joined Grant on his headquarters boat, which was stationed on the right bank of the river, where from the bows we could see the squadron as it started, and could follow its course until it was nearly past Vicksburg. Just before 10 o'clock on the night of April 16th, the squadron cast loose its moorings. It was a strange scene. First, a mass of black things detached itself from the shore, and we saw it float out toward the middle of the stream. There was nothing to be seen except this big black mass, which dropped slowly down the river. Soon another black mass detached itself, and another, then another. It was Admiral Porter's fleet of ironclad turtles, steamboats, and barges. They floated down the Mississippi darkly and silently, showing neither steam nor light, save occasionally a signal astern, where the enemy could not see it. The vessels moved at intervals of about 200 yards. First came 7 ironclad turtles and 1 heavy-armed ram. Following these were 2 side-wheel steamers and 1 stern wheel, having 12 barges in tow. These barges carried the supplies. Far astern of them was one carrying ammunition. The most of the gunboats had already doubled the tongue of land which stretches northeasterly in front of Vicksburg, and they were immediately under the guns of nearly all the Confederate batteries, when there was a flash from the upper forts. And then for an hour and a half the cannonade was terrific, raging incessantly along the line of about 4 miles in extent. I counted 525 discharges. Early in the action, the enemy put the torch to a frame building in front of Vicksburg to light up the scene and direct his fire. About 12:45 a.m., one of our steamers, the Henry Clay, took fire and burned for 3/4 of an hour. The Henry Clay was lost by being abandoned by her captain and crew in a panic, they thinking her to be sinking. The pilot refused to go with them, and said if they would stay they would get her through safe. After they had fled in the yawls, the cotton bales on her deck took fire, and one wheel became unmanageable. The pilot then ran her aground and got upon a plank, on which she was picked up 4 miles below. The morning after Admiral Porter had run the Vicksburg batteries, I went with General Grant to New Carthage to review the situation. We found the squadron there, all in fighting condition, though most of them had been hit. Not a man had been lost. As soon as we returned to Milliken's Bend, Grant ordered that 6 transport steamers, each loaded with 100,000 rations and 40 days' coal, should be made ready to run the Vicksburg batteries. The order was executed on the night of the 22nd. The transports were manned throughout, officers, engineers, pilots, and deckhands, by volunteers from the army, mainly from Logan's division. This dangerous service was sought with great eagerness, and experienced men had been found for every post. If 10,000 men had been wanted instead of 150, they would have engaged with zeal in the adventure. In addition to bulwarks of hay, cotton, and pork barrels, each transport was protected by a barge on each side of it. Orders were to drop noiselessly down, with a current from the mouth of the Yazoo, and not show steam till the enemy's batteries began firing, when the boats were to use all their legs. The night was cloudy, and the run was made with the loss of one of the transports, the Tigress, which was sunk and a few men wounded. The day after these transports with supplies ran the Vicksburg batteries, General Grant changed his headquarters to Smith's Plantation, near New Carthage. All of McClernand's corps, the 13th, was now near there, and that officer said 10,000 men would be ready to move from New Carthage the next day. McPherson's corps, which had been busy upon the Lake Providence expedition and other services, but which had been ordered to join, was now, except one division, moving over from Milliken's Bend. Sherman's corps, the 15th, which had been stationed at Young's Point, was also under marching orders to New Carthage. Grant's first object now was to cross the Mississippi as speedily as possible, and capture Grand Gulf before it could be reinforced. But first it was necessary to know the strength of this point. On the 22nd, Admiral Porter had gone down with his gunboats, and opened fire to ascertain the position and strength of the batteries. He reported them too strong to overcome, and earnestly advised against a direct attack. He suggested that the troops either be marched down the west side from New Carthage to a point where they could be ferried over the Mississippi just below Grand Gulf, or that they be embarked on the transports and barges and floated past the batteries in the night. The day after Grant changed his headquarters to Smith's Plantation, he went himself with General Porter to reconnoiter Grand Gulf. His reconnaissance convinced him that the place was not so strong as Admiral Porter had supposed, and an attack was ordered to be made as soon as the troops could be made ready, the next day, April 26th, if possible. An irritating delay occurred then, however. McClernand's corps was not ready to move. When we came to Smith's Plantation on the 24th, I had seen that there was apparently much confusion in McClernand's command, and I was astonished to find, now that he was ordered to move across the Mississippi, that he was planning to carry his bride with her servants and baggage along with him, although Grant had ordered that officers should leave behind everything that could impede the march. On the 26th, the day when it was hoped to make an attack on Grand Gulf, I went with Grant by water from our headquarters at Smith's Plantation down to New Carthage and to Perkins' plantation below, where 2 of McClernand's divisions were encamped. These troops, it was supposed, were ready for immediate embarkation, and there were quite as many as all the transports could carry. But the first thing which struck us both on approaching the points of embarkation was that the steamboats and barges were scattered about in the river and in the bayou, as if there was no idea of the imperative necessity of the promptest movement possible. We at once steamed to Admiral Porter's flagship, which was lying just above Grand Gulf, and Grant sent for McClernand, ordering him to embark his men without losing a moment. In spite of this order, that night at dark, when a thunderstorm set in, not a single cannon or man had been moved. Instead, McClernand held a review of a brigade of Illinois troops at Perkins about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At the same time, a salute of artillery was fired, notwithstanding the positive orders that had repeatedly been given to use no ammunition for any purpose except against the enemy. When we got back from the river to headquarters on the night of the 26th, we found that McPherson had arrived at Smith's Plantation with the 1st Division of his corps, the rear being not very far behind. His whole force would have been up the next day, but it was necessary to arrest its movements until McClernand could be got out of the way. This made McClernand's delay the more annoying. General Lorenzo Thomas, who was on the Mississippi at this time organizing Negro troops, told me that he believed now that McPherson would actually have his men ready to embark before McClernand. Early the next morning, April 27th, I went with Grant from Smith's Plantation back to New Carthage. As soon as we arrived, the general wrote a very severe letter to McClernand, but learning that at last the transport steamers and barges had been concentrated for use, he did not send the rebuke. Grant spent the day there completing the preparations for embarking, and on the morning of the 28th about 10,000 men were on board. This force was not deemed sufficient for the attack on Grand Gulf, so the troops were brought down to Hard Times Landing, on the Louisiana side, almost directly across the river from Grand Gulf, where a portion of them were debarked, and the transport sent back for Hovey's division, 6,000 strong. We spent the night at Hard Times waiting for these troops, which arrived about daylight on the morning of the 29th. There were now 16,000 men at Hard Times ready to be landed at the foot of the Grand Gulf bluff as soon as its batteries were silenced. At precisely 8 o'clock the gunboats opened their attack. 7, all ironclads, were engaged, and a cannonade was kept up for nearly 6 hours. We soon found that the enemy had 5 batteries, the first and most formidable of them being placed on the high promontory, close to the mouth of the Big Black. The lower batteries, mounting smaller guns and having no more than 2 pieces each, were silenced early in the action, but this one obstinately resisted. For the last 4 hours of the engagement the whole 7 gunboats were employed in firing at this one battery, now at long range, seeking to drop shells within the parapet, now at the very foot of the hill within about 200 yards, endeavoring to dismount its guns by direct fire. It was hit again and again, but its pieces were not disabled. At last, about 1:30 o'clock, Admiral Porter gave the signal to withdraw. The gunboats had been hit more or less severely. I was on board the Benton during the attack, and saw that her armor had been pierced repeatedly, both in her sides and her pilot house, but she had not a gun disabled, and except for the holes through her mail, some of them in her hull, she was as ready to fight as at the beginning of the action. The batteries having proved too much for the gunboats, General Grant determined to execute an alternative plan, which he had had in mind from the first. That was to debark the troops and march them south across the peninsula which faces Grand Gulf to a place out of reach of the Confederate guns. While the engagement between the gunboats and batteries had been going on, all the rest of McClernand's corps had reached Hard Times, having marched around by land, and 3 divisions of McPherson's corps had also come up. This entire body of about 35,000 men was immediately started across the peninsula to Deschutes' plantation, where it was proposed to embark them again. Late in the evening I left Hard Times with Grant to ride across the peninsula to Deschutes. The night was pitch dark, and as we rode side by side, Grant's horse suddenly gave a nasty stumble. I expected to see the general go over the animal's head, and I watched intently, not to see if he was hurt, but if he would show any anger. I had been with Grant daily now for 3 weeks, and I had never seen him ruffled or heard him swear. His equanimity was becoming a curious spectacle to me. When I saw his horse lunge, my first thought was, "Now he will swear." For an instant his moral status was on trial. But Grant was a tenacious horseman, and instead of going over the animal's head, as I imagined he would, he kept his seat. Pulling up his horse, he rode on, and, to my utter amazement, without a word or sign of impatience. And it is a fact that though I was with Grant during the most trying campaigns of the war, I never heard him use an oath. In order to get the transports past Grand Gulf, Porter's gunboats had engaged the batteries about dusk. This artillery duel lasted until about 10 o'clock, the gunboats withdrawing as soon as the transports were safely past, and steaming at once to Deschutes plantation, where General McClernand's corps was all ready to take the transports. The night was spent in embarking the men. By 11 o'clock the next morning, April 30th, 3 divisions were landed on the east shore of the Mississippi, at the place General Grant had selected. This was Bruinsburg, 60 miles south of Vicksburg, and the first point south of Grand Gulf, from which the highlands of the interior could be reached by a road over dry land. I was obliged to separate from Grant on the 30th, for the means of transporting troops and officers were so limited that neither an extra man nor a particle of unnecessary baggage was allowed, and I did not get over until the morning of May 1st, after the army had moved on Port Gibson, where they first engaged the enemy. As soon as I was landed at Bruinsburg, I started in the direction of the battle, on foot of course, as no horses had been brought over. I had not gone far before I overtook a quartermaster driving toward Port Gibson. He took me into his wagon. About 4 miles from Port Gibson we came upon the first signs of the battle, a field where it was evident that there had been a struggle. I got out of the wagon as we approached, and started toward a little white house with green blinds, covered with vines. The little white house had been taken as a field hospital, and the first thing my eyes fell upon as I went into the yard was a heap of arms and legs which had been amputated and thrown into a pile outside. I had seen men shot, and dead men plenty, but this pile of legs and arms gave me a vivid sense of war, such as I had not before experienced. As the army was pressing the Confederates toward Port Gibson all that day, I followed in the rear without overtaking General Grant. While trailing along after the Union forces, I came across Fred Grant, then a lad of 13, who had been left asleep by his father on a steamer at Bruinsburg, but who had started out on foot like myself as soon as he awoke and found the army had marched. We tramped and foraged together until the next morning, when some officers who had captured 2 old horses gave us each one. We got the best bridles and saddles we could, and thus equipped, made our way into Port Gibson, which the enemy had deserted, and where General Grant now had his headquarters. I rode that old horse for 4 or 5 days, then by chance I got a good one. A captured Confederate officer had been brought before General Grant for examination. Now this man had a very good horse, and after Grant had finished his questions, the officer said, "General, this horse and saddle are my private property. They do not belong to the Confederate army. They belong to me as a citizen, and I trust you will let me have them. Of course, while I am a prisoner, I do not expect to be allowed to ride the horse, but I hope you will regard him as my property and finally restore him to me." "Well," said Grant, "I've got 4 or 5 first-rate horses wandering somewhere about this Southern Confederacy. They have been captured from me in battle or by spies. I will authorize you, whenever you find one of them, to take possession of him. I'd cheerfully give him to you, but as for this horse, I think he is just about the horse Mr. Dana needs." I rode my new acquisition afterward through that whole campaign, and when I came back, I turned him over to the quartermaster. Whenever I went out with General Grant anywhere, he always had some question to ask about that horse. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Savannah Allday.